There exists a particular silence in the forests of East Prussia that has no equal elsewhere. It is the silence of centuries, of pine and oak and birch growing in soil that has held empires, of wind moving through branches that have witnessed the passage of armies and the quiet persistence of seasons. It was in this silence that Klaus Brenner learned to listen. He was born in 1910 in a village 30 kilometers east of Königsberg, the son of a gamekeeper and a woman whose name appears in no official records beyond her marriage certificate. His childhood was unremarkable by the standards of provincial German life: schooling through the 8th grade, apprenticeship to his father's profession, the gradual acquisition of knowledge about animals and weather, and the particular patience required to move through a forest without disturbing it. By 1930, at 20 years of age, Klaus Brenner was the finest hunter in 3 counties. The skill was not dramatic or boastful. It manifested as a practical competency, the ability to track game across difficult terrain, to read wind patterns and animal behavior, to understand the physics of ballistics and the psychology of prey. He could move through forests in complete silence. He could wait for hours in conditions that would break ordinary men. He could fire a rifle with precision at distances that other hunters considered impossible. These were not military skills. They were the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his entire consciousness engaged with a single landscape and the creatures that inhabited it. The rifle he carried was a Mannlicher Schönauer Model 1903, a civilian hunting weapon, not military issue. The rifle was old, manufactured in Austria-Hungary decades before Klaus was born, but it had been maintained with meticulous care by successive owners. Klaus had acquired it in 1929 for a sum that represented 5 months of wages. The rifle was, to him, more valuable than property. It was an extension of his understanding of distance and precision. Klaus married in 1932 a woman named Elizabeth from the neighboring village, the daughter of a timber merchant. They had 2 children by 1936, a son and a daughter, and lived in a cottage on the edge of the forest where Klaus continued his work as a hunter, providing game for local markets and conducting guided hunts for wealthy clients from Berlin and Hamburg who wished to experience the romance of the East Prussian wilderness. He was, by every available measure, a man entirely disconnected from the political currents that were reshaping Germany. His consciousness was occupied with the cycles of seasons, the migration patterns of deer, the behavior of wolves that occasionally descended from deeper forests in harsh winters. When the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, Klaus noted the change as one might note a shift in weather, acknowledging it, adjusting practical behaviors accordingly, but not experiencing it as an internal transformation. The war, when it came in September 1939, reached Klaus Brenner as news transmitted through radio broadcasts and official announcements. Poland was invaded. The Wehrmacht moved east. Military conscription began. Klaus, at 29 years old, was called to service in the spring of 1940. He reported to an army induction center in Königsberg with his civilian Mannlicher and a letter of recommendation from the local hunting authority noting his exceptional marksmanship. The officer processing his induction examined the rifle with obvious skepticism. Military weapons were standardized issue. Civilian weapons were not preferred. But the letter was impressive, and Klaus's scores on the Army's marksmanship qualification tests were extraordinary, virtually perfect at all tested distances. By June 1940, Klaus Brenner was assigned to the Wehrmacht's sniper training program, which was then being formalized as the demand for precision marksmen increased across the expanding Eastern Front. The training was, to Klaus, almost incomprehensibly simple. The instructors taught tactics that seemed obvious to him: the importance of concealment, the selection of firing positions, the calculation of wind drift and distance. These were principles he had already internalized through decades of hunting. The only difference was that he would now be shooting at men rather than animals. Klaus absorbed this distinction with the pragmatism of someone trained to accept practical realities. In the forest, one killed to survive and to feed one's family. In war, one killed because the state had directed one to do so. The act itself was not fundamentally different. The conscience required adjustment, but Klaus had the capacity for such adjustment. He had learned patience and discipline. He had learned to separate emotion from action. He had learned to wait. By the autumn of 1940, Klaus Brenner had been designated a Wehrmacht sniper and assigned to a rifle division preparing for operations in Russia. His Mannlicher Schönauer had been retained as his personal weapon, an unusual exception to standard protocol that reflected both its superior performance characteristics and Klaus's demonstrated mastery of it. He was 29 years old. He had never fired at a human being. He had never been in combat. He had only ever been a hunter in forests that belonged to him in ways that could not be articulated but were perfectly understood. The war would teach him that forests existed everywhere, even in the flat terrain of Western Russia, if one understood how to see them. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. And Klaus Brenner crossed into Soviet territory 3 weeks later as part of the Wehrmacht's southern advance. The landscape was not the familiar forests of East Prussia. It was open, relatively flat, punctuated by sparse villages and vast agricultural fields that had been harvested or left to grow wild as the war disrupted normal farming patterns. The terrain seemed to offer little concealment, and Klaus struggled initially with the transition from his intimate knowledge of dense European forest to this more exposed geography. But he learned. The open terrain required different tactics, different reading of wind patterns over greater distances, different calculation of engagement ranges. What might have been a 100-meter shot in the forests of Prussia became a 400 or 500-meter shot in the Russian steppe. Klaus's training in distance estimation proved invaluable. He learned to measure ranges by the apparent size of targets, to compensate for the curvature of the Earth across extreme distances, to account for atmospheric conditions that changed visibility and ballistic performance. More importantly, he learned the discipline of patience in a context that demanded immediate results. The Wehrmacht's advance was rapid through the summer of 1941. Soviet forces were in retreat, regrouping, attempting to establish defensive positions along various river lines and terrain features. Klaus was attached to a rifle company as their dedicated sniper, tasked with engaging enemy soldiers at distances beyond the effective range of standard infantry rifles. His role was to eliminate command personnel, to suppress Soviet positioning, to alter tactical calculations through the threat of precision fire. In August 1941, Klaus Brenner fired his first shot at a Soviet soldier. The target was a Red Army officer visible through Klaus's rifle scope approximately 600 meters distant, standing on a slight rise observing German positions. Klaus calculated the wind. There was a crosswind of perhaps 3 knots coming from the north, and he adjusted his aim accordingly. He held his breath. He executed the shot. The Soviet officer collapsed. Klaus did not know if the man was dead or wounded. The distance was too great for confirmation, but the result was immediate. Soviet soldiers broke from their positions and retreated to new cover. Klaus felt nothing. The shot had been technically perfect. A clean execution of skills he had been developing his entire conscious life. That the shot had likely killed a human being registered intellectually, but did not produce emotional response. This was the same emotional discipline that a hunter required when killing an animal that had been observed and understood and suddenly transformed into a target. Over the following months, Klaus became increasingly effective. His accuracy at extreme ranges became legendary within his unit. Soviet snipers learned to fear him. German officers requested his attachment to their operations, understanding that a single, well-placed shot from Klaus Brenner could alter tactical situations. His confirmed kill count grew, 37 by December 1941, 72 by the summer of 1942, approaching 150 by the end of that year. But Klaus understood something about the mathematics of killing that most soldiers did not. The number itself was meaningless. Each shot was a discrete event, separated from all others by time and circumstance. The accumulation of discrete events into a statistic was something that happened in headquarters, in official records, in the calculations of officers who were attempting to measure military effectiveness. For Klaus, each shot was simply the application of discipline and skill to a problem: how to place a bullet into a specific location at a specific distance under specific atmospheric conditions. The killing itself, the transformation of a human being into a casualty, was the responsibility of the state, not of the individual marksman. Klaus had learned this distinction early and had built his entire psychological approach to combat around it. By 1943, Klaus Brenner had been designated the Wehrmacht's most effective sniper. His confirmed kills exceeded 400. He had been recommended for decoration, but he declined official recognition, requesting instead that he be allowed to continue his work without ceremony or attention. The recommendation was unusual enough that it moved through command channels, ultimately reaching the desk of a Wehrmacht intelligence officer named Captain Friedrich Hessler. Hessler was intrigued. He traveled to Klaus's unit in February 1943 to conduct a personal interview with this sniper who had become a legend but remained invisible. What Hessler discovered was not the dramatic figure he had anticipated, but a quiet man of 32 years who spoke in measured sentences about wind patterns and ballistic trajectories as though these were the most natural topics of conversation. "You have killed more than 400 men," Hessler said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I have fired 437 successful shots," Klaus corrected gently. "The determination of whether a man is dead or alive after being struck by a bullet traveling at high velocity is not something I can control. I can only control the precision of the shot." Hessler was struck by this response. Most soldiers, even officers, would have claimed the kills directly, would have expressed pride or satisfaction, or at least acknowledgement of the achievement. Klaus's response suggested a compartmentalization of responsibility that was philosophically unusual. "What has this work cost you?" Hessler asked. Klaus considered the question carefully before responding. "I'm still able to sleep. I'm still able to function. I'm still able to calculate wind drift and execute shots with precision. As long as these capacities remain intact, the work continues. If they should deteriorate, I would request reassignment." "You feel no remorse?" "I feel no emotion," Klaus said. "That is different from remorse. I executed my role. The responsibility for that role lies with those who assigned it. I am simply the instrument through which the assignment is executed." Hessler reported his findings to his superiors, describing Klaus as a man of exceptional psychological compartmentalization, who has achieved extraordinary military results through the systematic application of civilian hunting skills to military objectives. The assessment was filed in Klaus's personnel record, classified as restricted, and noted in subsequent performance evaluations. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. The winter of 1943-1944 was brutal beyond previous experience. The Eastern Front had stabilized into a grinding attritional conflict where neither side could achieve decisive advantage. Klaus was by then attached to a defensive position near Smolensk, where Wehrmacht forces were attempting to hold territory against increasingly aggressive Soviet counteroffensives. His role had evolved from offensive sniper support to defensive engagement, using precision fire to slow Soviet advances and create casualties that would reduce the momentum of attacks. The terrain around Smolensk was a mixture of forest and open ground, with frozen rivers and scattered villages providing natural defensibility. Klaus established a primary firing position in the upper floor of a partially destroyed building that offered clear sightlines across an approach route that Soviet forces would likely use. He created a secondary position approximately 300 meters away in the remains of a church bell tower. A third position, for emergency retreat, was located deeper in the forest. This was not hunting. This was warfare conducted with the precision of hunting technique. Klaus understood the distinction perfectly. In hunting, there was flexibility, the ability to move and search and wait for opportunity. In warfare, there was rigid positioning, the need to maintain territory, the responsibility to inflict casualties within a defined area before being overwhelmed by numerical superiority. By January 1944, Klaus had been in position near Smolensk for 3 months. His confirmed kill count in that sector alone had reached 87. He had become such a recognized threat that Soviet forces had dedicated resources to eliminating him: counter-snipers, artillery barrages on suspected positions, infantry assaults designed specifically to dislodge him, and his defensive fire support. On January 15, 1944, Klaus was engaged by a Soviet sniper, a man whom Klaus would never see, never know the name of, but who would define the final portion of Klaus's combat service. The Soviet sniper was skilled. He had established a position approximately 1,000 meters from Klaus's primary firing location, a distance that seemed impossibly far for effective sniper engagement. But Klaus had been receiving sporadic fire from that direction for 2 days, and he had learned that the Soviet sniper understood distance calculations and wind compensation. They were, in essence, colleagues in a specialized discipline, separated only by ideology and circumstance. Klaus understood that the Soviet sniper represented a threat that could not be ignored. The conventional response would have been to relocate positions and avoid direct confrontation. But Klaus recognized something else. This was an opportunity to engage with another practitioner of the same discipline at a level of mastery that Klaus had rarely experienced. He made the decision to engage the Soviet sniper directly. The first step was to understand the Soviet position precisely. Klaus spent an entire day calculating trajectories, analyzing the angle and timing of the Soviet fire, estimating the exact location from which the fire was being directed. By evening, he had narrowed the probable location to a specific tree line approximately 970 meters distant. At dawn on January 16th, Klaus deliberately exposed himself in his primary position, knowing that the Soviet sniper would respond. The shot came within minutes, a round that passed close enough to Klaus to be heard, but far enough away to miss. Klaus immediately noted the trajectory, made final calculations, and executed his response. He fired a single shot at the calculated position. There was no confirmation of the result. The distance was too great for visual verification. Klaus remained in position, aware that if he had merely wounded the Soviet sniper or missed entirely, the retaliatory fire would reveal the failure. But no fire came. The Soviet sniper did not respond. Klaus maintained his position for another 4 hours, monitoring the suspected sniper location for any sign of movement or renewed engagement. Nothing emerged. By late morning, Klaus made the assessment that the threat had been neutralized. He would never know with certainty if he had killed the Soviet sniper or if that man had simply relocated positions. This uncertainty became emblematic of Klaus's understanding of his own effectiveness. Confirmed kills were verified through observation of fallen bodies or through intelligence reports. Unconfirmed kills existed in a category of probability and assumption. Klaus did not allow himself to inflate the unconfirmed kills into his personal accounting. If a shot could not be verified, it was simply a shot that had been executed with precision toward a calculated target, but the Soviet sniper did not return. The threat ended. Klaus's position held. By February 1944, Klaus had been operating on the Eastern Front for nearly 3 years. His confirmed kill count had exceeded 600. He was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. He had compartmentalized his emotions successfully, but he understood that compartments, even when sealed, eventually leak. The pressure of 3 years of continuous killing, of maintaining the psychological discipline required to view each human death as a discrete ballistic problem, was beginning to accumulate. In March 1944, Klaus was withdrawn from combat for what the Wehrmacht designated as psychological evaluation and reassessment. He was transported to a medical facility in Berlin, where he was interviewed by military psychiatrists who were attempting to understand how a man could kill over 600 human beings without manifesting the psychological deterioration that normally accompanied such action. Klaus was honest in these interviews. He described his training, his discipline, his compartmentalization. He acknowledged that he did not feel remorse, but he also did not claim to feel satisfaction. He was simply a man who had applied skills learned in civilian life to military objectives, and he continued to function effectively at that application. The psychiatrists concluded that Klaus represented a case of exceptional psychological resilience, combined with a particular cognitive structure that permitted compartmentalization of moral responsibility. They classified him as suitable for continued service, but recommended a reduced operational tempo to prevent eventual psychological degradation. Klaus was reassigned to a training role, instructing other Wehrmacht snipers in the techniques and discipline that had made him so effective. The position was less demanding than frontline service, though no less intellectually rigorous. He spent the months from April through December 1944 training other marksmen, attempting to convey the philosophy and technique that had sustained his effectiveness. It was during this training assignment that Klaus began to understand something he had not fully articulated before. The patience required for hunting and the patience required for killing were not the same thing. The hunter's patience was rooted in respect for the prey and acknowledgement of the complexity of the natural world. The soldier's patience was rooted in discipline and the acceptance of responsibility for actions one did not emotionally own. The distinction mattered, though Klaus could not articulate why. By early 1945, the war had transformed into a desperate defensive struggle. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. The Wehrmacht was being compressed into an increasingly small territory. Klaus was assigned to a defensive position near Berlin, part of a last-stand force that understood, perhaps better than any military force in history, that they were fighting for a state that was already lost. Klaus was 44 years old. He had spent 5 years in military service, 3.5 of those years on the Eastern Front. He had executed well over 600 confirmed shots. He was recognized as a master of his craft, though the craft itself seemed increasingly meaningless in a context where the outcome was no longer in doubt. In April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. Klaus participated in the defense of the city from street to street, building to building, as Soviet forces advanced systematically. His sniper skills, developed across vast distances in the forests and steppes of Russia, were now applied to urban warfare. Shots across rubble-filled streets, engagements at ranges of 50 or 100 meters rather than 500 or 1,000. On May 2, 1945, as Soviet forces consolidated control of the city, Klaus Brenner was captured. He was separated from other prisoners and placed in temporary custody by Soviet intelligence officers who recognized his identity from intelligence files that the Russians had compiled on particularly effective Wehrmacht snipers. For 3 days, Klaus was interrogated. The questions concerned his methods, his training, his psychological approach to killing. The interrogators seemed genuinely interested in understanding how a man could develop such mastery at destruction. Klaus answered their questions with the same precision and honesty that he had applied to his sniper craft. There seemed little purpose in deception. On the 4th day, Klaus was transferred to a Soviet prisoner of war camp. He would spend the next 9 years in Soviet custody, the final 4 of those years in a labor camp in the Urals, where he worked in mining operations until his release in 1954. The war that had defined 5 years of Klaus's life ended. Germany was divided. The forest of his childhood was now behind Soviet lines, in a Poland that had been restructured and reorganized. Klaus would never return to the landscape where he had learned the skills that would define his military service. When he was released in 1954, Klaus was 43 years old and completely displaced from the world he had known. His wife, Elizabeth, had survived the war, but their cottage was gone. The forests of East Prussia were now foreign territory. The Germany to which he returned was divided, reduced, occupied. It was not the Germany he had served, though it was the Germany that had emerged from that service. Klaus settled in Bavaria, in the relatively intact southern region of West Germany. He found work as a hunting guide, a profession that seemed almost impossibly distant from his recent past. The skills that had made him legendary as a Wehrmacht sniper, patience, precision, discipline, the ability to move through landscapes without disturbing them, were now applied to guiding wealthy tourists through forests, teaching them how to track game, how to move silently, how to understand the language of wind and animals. He married again in 1957, a woman named Greta, who had lost her first husband in the war and who did not ask Klaus about his military service. They had a daughter in 1958. Klaus raised his child in an environment of deliberate normalcy, never discussing his years on the Eastern Front, never describing the discipline and compartmentalization that had sustained his effectiveness as a killing instrument. By the 1960s, Klaus Brenner had become simply a hunting guide in Bavaria, a man known for his exceptional skill at tracking game and understanding wildlife behavior. The 600 confirmed kills, the military service, the psychological compartmentalization that had allowed him to function as a precision instrument of war, all of this receded into the past, into the category of experience that could not be adequately described to those who had not lived it. Klaus Brenner died in 1983 at the age of 73. His death was unremarkable, a heart attack while hunting in the forests near his home, a conclusion that seemed almost appropriate to those who knew him. He was buried in a local cemetery. The funeral was attended by a small group of people, his wife, his children, a few colleagues from his work as a hunting guide. No mention was made of his military service. No official recognition was offered. The 600 confirmed kills, the medals he had declined, the reputation that had made him legendary on the Eastern Front, all of these remained classified in Soviet and German archives, accessible only to historians and military researchers willing to excavate the detailed records of a war that had ended nearly 40 years before his death. After Klaus's death, his rifle, the Mannlicher Schönauer Model 1903 that had been his constant companion since 1929, passed to his son, who had no particular interest in hunting. The rifle was eventually sold to a collector of military weapons, who recognized its significance and attempted to document its history. The collector discovered, through meticulous research, that this particular rifle had been registered to Klaus Brenner during his military service. The collector published a brief article in a German military history magazine, noting the coincidence of acquisition and asking if anyone possessed additional information about this particular weapon. The article generated minimal response. Klaus's military service was not dramatic in the way that military histories typically demand. He had been effective, but he had been quiet about it. He had declined recognition. He had compartmentalized his experience in ways that prevented the kind of grandiose narrative that military histories typically celebrate. But the rifle remained. It was purchased by a war museum in southern Germany, where it was displayed in a case alongside other Wehrmacht weapons with a placard identifying it as a model 1903 Mannlicher Schönauer personal rifle of Klaus Brenner, Wehrmacht Sniper 1940-1945, confirmed kills 600 plus. Visitors to the museum would occasionally pause at that display, reading the brief description and attempting to comprehend what such a number meant. 600 human beings, over 600 men killed by a single person using a single rifle over a 5-year period. The mathematics of it seemed almost incomprehensible. But the rifle itself was silent. It did not speak about the patience required to become such an instrument of death. It did not articulate the discipline that allowed a man to maintain psychological compartmentalization across years of continuous killing. It did not explain how a hunter from the forests of East Prussia had been transformed into the Wehrmacht's deadliest sniper. And then, after the war ended, had simply returned to being a hunting guide, as though the intervening decades had been a temporary displacement from his true nature. The rifle only held the weight of what had been done with it. It held the accumulated distance of over 600 shots. It held the record of precision and discipline. It held the silence of a man who had accepted the role that history and circumstance and his own particular skills had assigned him. And in that silence, it testified to something that historians rarely acknowledge, that the most devastating weapons of war are not dramatic or technological or complex. They are patient, they are disciplined, they are human beings who have learned, through training and circumstance and their own psychological structure, to transform the act of killing into an application of technique, to separate the act from the emotion, to continue functioning as an instrument of destruction, even as they understand perfectly well what destruction means. Klaus Brenner had been such an instrument. The rifle was his testimony. And the silence of the forests where he had learned his initial skills, that silence was the true monument to what he had become and what he had accomplished before returning finally to the work of teaching others how to understand wild places and wild things. The rifle remains in the museum. Visitors pass by. The placard is read. The number 600 is contemplated. And then the visitors move forward, having understood nothing except the surface of the story, the number, the skill, the technical accomplishment. The depth remains hidden. It remains in the forests of East Prussia, in the distance between a hunter's patience and a soldier's discipline, in the space where Klaus Brenner learned to wait and to listen and to execute with precision the role that had been assigned to him by forces far larger than any individual will could resist. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.